So thanks very much, everybody, for joining me today. I hope it's going to be a useful 40 minutes. And I'm going to talk to you today about how we as trainers, as teacher trainers, as teacher educators, can produce and deliver successful training sessions. And the way that I want to do this is by thinking, first of all, about what effective teachers do. What is it that expert teachers do in the classroom? What is it that makes them expert in their profession? And we're going to link that with a discussion about how teachers actually learn. We talk a lot about how our learners learn, how students learn, but something that perhaps we don't consider enough is how teachers learn and how teachers develop. And once we have an understanding of the first 2 points, what it is that effective teachers do and how teachers learn and how teachers develop in our profession, then that has a direct link, obviously, with what we as effective trainers do. In other words, the processes that we need to go through in order to help teachers to develop. And I hope that by the end, we'll be able to make some conclusions as well. Okay, so let's begin with the first point, which is a consideration of what effective teachers do. And I want to start by showing you this gentleman over here on the right. You may or may not know who it is. It doesn't really matter if you don't know who it is, but this is Donald Freeman. And Donald Freeman made the point some years ago that we actually don't really have a definition of language teaching. We don't have a definition of what effective teachers do. And the problem there is that if we did have a definition, if we did have a clear agreement about what effective teaching is, then of course that would help us in our roles as trainers. If we knew that teachers did this, then that would help us to define and create training programs to support teachers. So Donald Freeman said that how we define language teaching will influence to a large extent how we educate people as language teachers. So there's obviously a direct link between the two things there. So very quickly, just for a bit of fun, 60 seconds, I want you to define language teaching. No, I don't. I don't want you to define language teaching. I just want you to very quickly in the chat box, type in any words that come to mind, any phrases that come to mind when you think about language teaching.
So to help students communicate effectively, comprehensible input, okay, flexibility, facilitating learning, insight of the teacher, assessment.
Nice one. Okay, I'm just going to put a few on the screen. This is not a finite list. I'm not even saying that I'm right and you're wrong, but these are just words and phrases which come up when we think about what language teaching is. And of course, here's the problem. We can't actually agree on what language teaching is, or maybe what we do agree on is that language teaching is just incredibly complex and very, very broad and also very, very deep. There's so much involved in language teaching that it's very difficult to come up with a definition. And if we go back to the previous quote, it's only when we understand what effective teachers do that we can hope to be in a position to actually help teachers to develop themselves. Thomas Farrell reinforces this point. He says there are no benchmarks. There are no standards for teaching. He says that there are no precise benchmarks of what actually constitutes effective second language teaching. But I think the important thing is it's the next three words, in all settings. That's important because there are definitely benchmarks within the ELI, for example, at KAU. And indeed, there are benchmarks at other universities and colleges and schools. Organizations have an understanding of what they want to happen in classrooms. So effective teaching is very much linked to context, and I'll come back to context a bit later on. And Farrell continues and he says, also, there are no agreed effective strategies that teachers should implement in their classes. And of course, when you think about it, this does make an enormous amount of sense, doesn't it? Because just because something works here doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work there. a classroom with 15 students is very, very different from a classroom with 70 students. You can't do the same things. We're not saying that one is good and one is bad, one is right and wrong is wrong, one is better or one is worse. What we have to understand is that something that works in one place may not work necessarily in another. And just to bring this section to a bit of a close and to think more about benchmarks and what effective teachers do. John Loughran, Professor John Loughran from Monash University, he makes the point that an expert teacher has a high degree of self-awareness. Teachers are not just mechanical. They're not machines. They're not robots. They don't just do things. Well, hopefully they don't. They don't just do things because they're in the book. They actually do think about what they're doing. As they're thinking about what they're doing, they may take the opportunity to adjust or to do things slightly differently in order to help their students. So he says that expert teachers are aware of what they're doing. They have an understanding of what they're doing. And as a result, they monitor and adjust their teaching behaviors to bring out the best in their students. And of course, those last few words, that last line, that's the most important thing, isn't it? This is what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to help our students to be the best that they possibly can. And the only way that we can do that is by having a better understanding of what we're doing as teachers and reflecting on what we're doing and adjusting when necessary. It may not be necessary, but adjusting our behavior to bring out the best in our students. Amy Stewie says that expert teachers are always working behind the scenes to improve their teaching. In other words, teachers teach, they do their job. They do 3, 4, 5 lessons a day, or whatever it might be, 20, 30 lessons a week. But at the same time, they're working, as she says, behind the scenes. In other words, something else is going on, whether that's in the classroom or outside the classroom, it doesn't actually matter. But she believes very strongly that the expert teacher is always doing something over and above the actual lesson. And she believes that this is because expert teachers have confidence. She believes that expert teachers are confident about what they're doing. And because of that, they fall into routines. When you're confident about doing something, you do follow a routine. It almost becomes automatic behavior, if you like, an automatic reaction to what's going on, because we're confident about what we're doing. And because we're confident about what we're doing, and because we don't need to think too much about what we're doing, then we can also be working behind the scenes. And she says that expert teachers reinvest the resources freed up by the use of routines to tackle more advanced problems. So because I'm confident about what I'm doing, because I don't need to think too much, and that doesn't mean I'm not doing it in an effective manner, but it just means I don't need to focus 100% on this because I've done it so many times before. But it does mean that at the same time, I can be analyzing what I'm doing. I can be monitoring what I'm doing. I can be thinking about what I'm doing. So I've saved time, I've saved resources, and I can reinvest that time and reinvest those resources in order to consider other things. Now, I think there's an important word from Amy Tui, this word routines. And I'm sure all of us as teachers, at some point in our teaching careers, probably when we first started teaching, we were introduced to a type of lesson routine. I'm going to call it a lesson shape, a routine lesson shape. Present, practice, and produce. This was around in the 1960s. I can remember my first teaching in the early 80s when we did exactly this. This is what we were taught. And when I did my CELTA, wasn't called CELTA in my day, but when I did my CELTA, this was the lesson shape that we were taught. And I can remember holding on to this and trying to apply it to every single thing that I did in the classroom, at least in the initial years, whilst I was building up that confidence so that PPP did actually become a routine for me. I still come across people today in the year 2020, 2021, who talk to me about PPP, present, practice, produce. And that's not a bad thing. Because if it gives you the confidence, if it gives you to something to hold on to so that you perform more effectively as a teacher, then that's great. But of course, we also need to remember that there isn't just one lesson shape. I'm not going to ask you to type in the chat box, but of course you're familiar with Jim Scrivener. And in the mid-1990s, Jim Scrivener proposed his ARC lesson shape. I mean, he didn't call it a lesson shape, he called it a model, I guess. But I'm just using the term lesson shape because I think it helps me to understand what I'm talking about. But he talks about, or talked about, authentic use and restricted use and clarification. Jeremy Harmer, a bit later, in his famous methodology book, Practice of English Language Teaching, he talks about engage and study and activate. And one of the points that Harmer made was that engage, study, activate, although it's linear, although it's 1, 2, 3, you can jump around within his lesson shape of engage, study, and activate. More recently, Jason Anderson proposed this CAP or CAPE model, context analysis practice, and with some evaluation. And Jason Anderson was the first of these lesson shape experts, if you like, to start talking about context. And of course, this is what's very often been missing from some of these other models, is that the context is very robotic, it's very mechanical. I can remember books that I used in my first teaching where the context was ridiculous. It was so manipulated, it was unreal. Doesn't mean students didn't learn, of course they learned, but Jason Anderson makes the point that we really do need a realistic context for language. And of course, this is all links back to Jack Richards' communicative language teaching. I know there are others. I just want to add one more. You're probably all familiar with TTT, very often known as test, teach, test, which I hate because it's not test. So I call it task, teach, task, or if you like, do something, teach something, and then do something, whatever you want. But the idea is that you're evaluating through a task what students know, and then as a result of that, teaching them or supporting them or pre-teaching something to challenge them for the next task. And of course, the important thing about these lesson shapes, and this is what we need to take forward with our discussion, is that the lesson shape, it supports the teacher. That's the whole point of it. Lesson shapes support teachers as they go through the learning process. And as you build up confidence, as you worry less about what you're going to do, you fall into these routines. And it may be that in one particular lesson, you're actually using more than one lesson shape and switching between them. But you have this idea in your head, and this is what gives you the confidence, and this is what leads you to becoming an effective expert teacher. So the second thing I wanted to mention is how teachers learn. So how do we go beyond the lesson shape? Once we're confident with the lesson shape, once we can fall into that routine that Amy Sui talked about, once we can reinvest some of that very, very valuable time, what is it that we do in order to teach? So I'm going to ask you just to type a couple of things in the chat box, but I want you to think about how you've actually learned your teacher knowledge.
Okay, people are mentioning experience, reflection, workshops as well.
Yep.
PGCE training, research,
lovely,
trial and error, which I think we all do.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
At one point, postgraduate degrees, practicing feedback from peers, observations as well, peer observations, TESOL courses, reading.
Brilliant. That's exactly what I wanted to hear from you. And I think, many of us probably go down one of two routes with this, learning on the job, which I'm sure I heard Ian mention, people learning through experience, but also obviously going through studying or training, doing some sort of course. I know in my own experience, I was literally dropped into, not literally, you can't literally be dropped in, but you know what I mean. I was dropped in to the classroom in 1982, I think it was, in the UK, in a summer school for students from Italy. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I was completely clueless, but somebody said, why don't you do this PPP thing? And that was my savior. And it was only after that, after a couple of summers working in language schools in the UK, that I thought, yeah, I quite like this. I think I'd like to take this further. Then I did my my CELTA course. So I began by learning on the job, and then I went into the studying and the training. But I think for many people, possibly many of you here today, it was actually the other way around. You did your studying and your training first, and then you began to learn on the job. One thing that we mustn't forget is that before we make that decision that we want to teach, before we go into the classroom, before we do our PGCE or do our MA or whatever it is that we do, we ourselves have spent literally thousands of hours in classrooms. And it doesn't matter what we were learning, whether it was English or Arabic or history or geography or maths, chemistry, doesn't matter. But we've spent an enormous amount of time in the classroom observing other teachers from kindergarten right through to university, and possibly many of us are still doing it. I quite often observe teachers in the classroom, so I'm still learning about teaching through observing other teachers. And Dan Lorty, in this study called School Teacher, he makes this point that all of us have spent literally thousands of hours as students in classrooms. And he calls this the apprenticeship of observation. When you do an apprenticeship, you observe, you watch, and then you try to imitate what you've seen. So you take what you've observed and then you try it out for yourself. And I think many of us have done that. I can definitely remember on my CELTA course, one particular trainer, and some of the things that she did. I can still see her today, even though it's pretty much 35 years ago. I can still see her and remember exactly what she did, and it had a massive impact on me as a teacher in the early days of my teaching. And Godwin Jones, in this white paper, which you can download for free, just Google using mobile devices and you'll find this white paper. But Godwin Jones makes the point that I've just made, that many of us actually start to teach in the same way that we were taught. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong in seeing a good model and taking that model and then imitating. This is what we want our students to do. We model language to students in the best way that we can, either modeling it ourselves or using a video or audio, whatever it is. But we're modeling things to teachers in the same way that our own teachers were a model for us. Maybe it wasn't a conscious thing, but we sat there for hours, observing teachers. The point, of course, though, is that while we may do something outside the classroom, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will translate into classroom use. So all of us, I think I can confidently say all of us are very happy using a mobile phone. We know how to send messages. If you've got a smartphone, you know how to watch a video or go to a website or whatever. We're all incredibly happy using them outside the classroom. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to take them inside the classroom. How many of us will actually use a phone or other form of technology in the classroom, to facilitate students' learning, even though we're perfectly happy and confident to use them outside the classroom? Okay, so just a few more points to make about how teachers actually learn. Richards and Farrell point out the importance of context, and this is something that I mentioned earlier. We know very well that all teaching contexts are different. It doesn't matter if you're using the same book, but as soon as you use it with different students or in a different environment, then everything changes. Even with the same students, you can be using a book on one day and using exactly the same book the next day, and the reaction of the students can be completely different. And this is something which always challenges us as teachers. And Richards and Farrell make this point that part of the journey, if you like, of learning to teach, part of the journey or the progression in becoming a better teacher is understanding the characteristics of a teaching context, understanding what goes on within a particular context, because this will have a massive impact on teaching and, of course, on student learning. I'm sure many of you have had to go into a teaching context which you were unfamiliar with, and it increases your stress level, because if you don't understand what that teaching context is, you're really never 100% sure that things will work in the way that you want them to work. If I can just ask you very quickly, just to make sure we're clear about this, when I talk about characteristics of the teaching context, what do I actually mean? What is a characteristic of the teaching context?
Ideas coming in, the number of students,
Yes.
student needs,
Yes.
backgrounds
Yes.
of learners.
Yes. Yes.
People mention personalization, the students' proficiency levels, their
Yes.
culture.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All of these things. And also not forget the physical side, the shape of the classroom, the number of tables and chairs. Are the tables and chairs fixed to the floor, or can you move them? Does the overhead projector work? Are there any board pens? You know, all of this is what is involved in the characteristics of the teaching context. And of course, most of this is not in a teacher's control. Teachers cannot control the teaching context. You cannot control where you teach, and you cannot control who you teach. Much to our disgruntlement very often, that, you know, we wish we could change and move things around, but all of those things are outside of our control. And this is what creates stress, and this is what creates challenge for our teachers. And this is why context is so important. And one last thing I'd like to, one last quote I want to show you from Childs, again about teaching context. You know, we're talking about how teachers learn, so that we can make a connection with the final part, which is what do trainers do? And the point is, trainers need to help teachers to understand the teaching context. So Childs makes the point, it's quite a long quote, so I'll leave you to read that one. So Childs is making the point that it's impossible for a professional development program, whether that's something like CELTA, which Ian just mentioned. Ian is a CELTA main course tutor, or one of the programs that, you know, I've delivered with teachers at the ELI or at TAFE University or one of the other universities in the kingdom. It doesn't matter where it is that you're doing it. We cannot, as teacher educators, prepare teachers to be ready to teach in every single context, because we don't know what every single context is. Of course, we can have an idea, and we know that one context is not the same as another. Even within the kingdom, one university has a different context, is a different context from another university, even if they're using the same books. But what we can do as educators, we can help teachers to understand how important context is, and that the context within which a teacher is teaching will have an impact on their whole understanding and awareness of the teaching process. And so as teacher educators, we do need to make sure that teachers understand the importance of context. And just one last point here before we move on to the final part of what I want to talk about today, is just a sort of putting together of all of these ideas about how teachers learn. I think there's probably 5 things that basically teachers learn from their own practice and from action research. They learn from personal reflection. Those of you that have worked with me on the Cambridge Train the Trainer course, you're probably sick to death of the number of times I've said, when are the teachers reflecting? Give the teachers an opportunity to reflect. Teachers need to reflect. They need to think back in order to think forward. Teachers also learn by interacting with each other and reflecting with other teachers, from teacher educators, from training, from workshops, and of course, from doing courses and through qualifications like CELTA and Delta. Okay, so the last part that I want to talk about is what effective trainers do. And I think, you know, the first point is an obvious one, that trainers are not working with students. Trainers are working with teachers, and therefore those traditional lesson shapes, the PPP, the TTT, the ARC, and so on, they're pretty much redundant when we talk about the work of a teacher trainer. And we need, if you like, a different shape and a different content for a training session. We can't have a PPP training session on CCQs, for example. It's just not the same approach. So here's a very, very short, brief, basic training session plan. It's not a lesson plan, it's a training session plan. I've just broken it down to 3 very short stages. And this particular training session is about CCQs, just have a very quick look at the 3 stages, and in the chat box, if you could just very quickly type the number of the stage, so number 1, and tell me what the aim is for that stage. Number 2, aim. Number 3, aim.
So we're thinking that number 1, assessing and adapting. Number 1 might be a lead-in.
Okay.
To engage the trainers.
Yes.
Input. That's for number 2.
Okay.
Number
Great.
1, objectives. Number 3, output. Okay.
Okay. I like that. Yep.
Yep. And again, number 1, to ensure the trainers or trainees are understanding.
Okay. Okay. Great. Thank you, Ian. Thanks so much for your help. I think we've got some nice answers there. And there's sort of a mixture. Somebody mentioned input and output, which I really like. There was I think somebody said something about evaluating the teachers, trying to understand what the teachers already know. So this is great. I want to break it down, and this is the model for a training session that was in the abstract for this session, into three areas. The first one, and these are just examples of behavior. It's not a finite list, but within our training session, we want teachers to have opportunities to micro-teach, to go deeper into different teaching practices, maybe to teach a demo lesson, and maybe to watch a lesson on a video or go into a classroom. So all of this is very, very practical, if you like. The second area is this one, which is our knowledge that we currently have, and all of our beliefs about teaching and learning that we've picked up, whether it's on the job or through doing a course, and opportunities for self-reflection. It also refers to our own assumptions and our own contexts. And the third area within this particular model is that we need opportunities for explanations and examples and theories and research. So we've got these three areas, and I'm calling them practical, personal, and the third one is professional. Now, unfortunately, it's PPP. And I've thought long and hard about this, and I've tried to change my adjectives, but I couldn't come up with anything better. But anyway, it's not PPP because this is not a linear lesson shape. This is a recipe, if you like. In other words, the things on the screen are ingredients which needs to be part of our training session. We need to include all of these three aspects in different quantities, depending on the context within which we're delivering the training. And I think from the practical perspective, the icon at the top is the trainer. Obviously, the icon underneath the word practical is the audience. And I think there's an equal balance here between what the trainer and what the trainees, the teachers, are actually doing. They're all involved in all of the things that are going on. If we go across to the personal, you'll see that the size of my trainer icon has reduced, but the size of the audience has remained the same. So in other words, the input, if you like, which somebody mentioned earlier, or the contribution of the trainer is much, much reduced. But it's very important as trainers that we get input from the teachers. We want to know what they believe. We want to know what their current knowledge is. We want them to reflect and think about their behaviors. We want to know what their assumptions are, and we want to understand what their context is, because the way that we deliver our training will depend very much on the teacher's context. And then when we go to the professional, again, those of you who have done a Train the Trainer course with me will know that I've often said to you, show your audience, show the teachers that you know what you're talking about. What have you read? Where's your research? So it's very important for the trainer to take a larger role in this, and the trainees will take more of a step back. That doesn't mean trainees can't contribute to the professional. Of course, trainee teachers will have read things, they'll understand things, and of course they can contribute to this particular part of our model. But it's quite likely that the balance will be much, much more in favor of the trainer inputting their professional explanations and examples and so on. So what I'm trying to show here with this diagram is that we have a session shape, a model which needs to involve all of these things, all mixed up as an ingredient for a cake. It's not linear. It's not one after the other. So you could begin with practical, you could begin with professional, you could begin with personal. It doesn't really matter as long as all three are elements within your training session. So just to recap what I've just said, teachers have these lesson shapes, but trainers have session shapes. That's difficult to say. And this is our mixture of the practical, personal, and professional elements. But let's remember that the two shapes, the lesson shape and the session shape, all actually have the same purpose. And the purpose is to support somebody as they learn a routine. Here's a draft training session. And this is an example of a possible training session on giving feedback on writing. So we're working with teachers, and we want to help our teachers to understand more about effective feedback on writing that students have produced. And over on the right-hand side, where those red blocks are, we're going to decide if it's a practical aspect or a personal aspect or a professional aspect. And do remember, it could be more than one. It doesn't just have to be one of these particular elements. So in the first stage, trainees evaluate a teacher's feedback on student writing. Now, I hope you will agree that that's a very practical activity. Teachers will be looking at something which the trainer has produced. There's also this personal element, because we want our teachers to use their own knowledge and their own beliefs and their own assumptions, and indeed their own context, to think about the students' writing. So we've got two possible elements there. The trainer presents key principles. Very obviously, this is the professional side. The trainer is giving the knowledge over to the teachers. So this is an example of a professional element. Based on that, trainees mark a sample of student text. So once again, we have an opportunity for a practical element. So you can see already in this particular structure, we have two opportunities for a practical element. And then lastly, trainees compare results and reflect. This obviously is very much the personal side again. So I want to impress on you that this is not about a linear progression like ARC or TTT or the 1960s PPP. This is about making sure that various elements appear within a training session. Here's just another example, a shorter one, 3 stages in this one. The trainer develops a looped reading demonstration lesson. In other words, the teachers are reading about the stages of a reading lesson. So this is very much a very nice example of how you can loop input into your sessions. So this is a lovely example of both practical, because the teachers are actually doing something. They're doing a reading task, but at the same time, they're learning about reading. And this is where the professional aspect comes in. So 2 birds with 1 stone in stage 1. And then we want the trainees to reflect. Hopefully now you don't need to think very much. You'll know that that's very personal. And then finally, trainees comment. So we have another opportunity for practical. Okay, so our practical stages then, I'll just very quickly conclude by hopefully making it clear what needs to go on in the practical stages. These are all of the personal actions and decisions that teachers make in their context. So teacher A over here and teacher B over here, we may be looking at the same materials, but coming up with different ways of using them because their contexts are different. And remember, as the trainer, as the teacher educator, what your goal is to make these actions and decisions as effective as possible. Because if the actions and decisions that the teachers make are effective actions and decisions, then of course this helps to implement change and maximize student learning. The professional stages refer to the knowledge elements and all of the key terminology provided by research. So when I talk about PPP and TTT and all of these things, and I mention Donald Freeman and I mention Amy Tsui, this shows you that I've done my homework before I sit here and I talk to you about these things. It's not just Peter spouting, his ideas, but it is based on research and things that other practitioners have said and do in the classroom, and of course in what we do as training. and it's going to inform and probably or even alter the personal side. A couple of points about the personal. This is all of the teacher's existing knowledge. What do they bring to the training? What can the teachers offer based on everything that they've done so far? It's their experiences, their beliefs, their opinions, their context, and so on. And all of that creates, if you like, a base, a foundation for everything that teachers do in the classroom. Once again, we've got this point that the context is incredibly important. You know, I've been in many opportunities with teachers, and we talk about something which everyone says is wonderful, and then somebody says, yes, but in my context, in my classroom, in my university, in my school, I can't do that, which is fair enough. But we would hope that teachers would dig a little bit deeper before they come up with the brick wall. The personal stage is also about sharing my own ideas. It's about collaborating, putting our ideas together. And very importantly, it hopefully gives teachers an opportunity to be critical. I don't mean to criticize each other, but to be critical here, I think, means to be able to reflect and to analyze behavior. So that was the model that I showed you earlier. That's just putting it all in front of you again. But let's just take away all of the words and just leave this idea. The three elements, the personal, the professional, and the practical, can appear in any way in this particular training session model, but it's important that all three do appear to a lesser or greater degree. So it's not PPP, it's PPP, depending on what it is that you're trying to get across to your teachers in your training session. And remember, if we get that balance right within our training session with our teachers, that will result in impact on our teachers and ultimately change in the classroom. Okay, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for being here today. A very big thank you to Ian for his chat box moderation. My email's on the screen. I'm really very happy to receive your messages if you've got questions that you want.